Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood at attention in the gleaming corridor of the Galactic Defense Academy, her human physique dwarfed by the towering Zenthari warriors beside her. The crystalline beings sparkled with natural armor that could deflect plasma rounds, while the hulking Corvin soldiers possessed strength that could crush steel with their bare hands. Sarah's plain military uniform seemed almost comical next to their impressive forms. Commander Vextar, a seasoned Zenthari officer with scars marking his translucent face, addressed the mixed-species training cohort. His voice resonated through the Academy's halls with the authority of someone who had survived countless battles against the Void Swarm, the galaxy's most feared enemy. "Today begins your final combat assessment," he announced, his crystalline features catching the artificial sunlight. "You will face simulated Void Swarm scenarios that have broken seasoned warriors. Some of you possess natural advantages." His gaze swept over the assembled aliens. "Others will need to prove their worth through cunning and determination." Sarah felt the weight of stares from her fellow cadets. The Zenthari exchanged knowing glances, their light-based communication flickering briefly between them. The Corvin simply grunted with what she assumed was amusement. Even the slender Etherian mystics with their telepathic abilities seemed to regard her with polite dismissal. Cadet Thorax, a particularly large Corvin with tusks that gleamed like polished ivory, stepped forward. "Commander, with respect, why are we training alongside primitives? Humans have no natural armor, no enhanced strength, no psychic abilities. They are barely evolved beyond their planet's surface." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. She had heard variations of this speech throughout her 3 years at the Academy. The other species meant no malice. They simply could not understand how humanity had earned a place among the stars when they seemed so unremarkable. Commander Vextar's expression remained neutral. "The Galactic Council deemed all member species worthy of military service. Your concerns are noted, Cadet Thorax." He turned his attention to Sarah. "Cadet Chen, you have consistently scored in the bottom third of physical assessments. Your tactical scores, however, place you in the top 5%. Explain this discrepancy." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "Sir, I believe warfare requires more than raw strength or natural defenses. Strategy, adaptability, and unconventional thinking often determine victory more than physical superiority." Several cadets chuckled quietly. Thorax shook his massive head. Pretty words from someone who cannot even lift a standard plasma cannon without assistance. The comment stung because it was true. Sarah had struggled with every piece of standard military equipment, all designed for beings far stronger than humans. She had spent countless hours in the Academy's workshops, modifying gear to suit her smaller frame and limited strength. While other cadets mastered combat techniques in weeks, she required months to achieve basic proficiency. Commander Vextar activated a holographic display showing their first simulation scenario. "You will be divided into teams of 5 and dropped into a recreation of the Kepler Station incident. The Void Swarm overwhelmed the station's defenses within hours, consuming every living being aboard. Your objective is simple survival for 48 simulated hours." The teams formed quickly along species lines. The Zenthari grouped together, their light speech creating a constant, subtle glow between them. The Corvins needed no words, simply standing near each other with the confidence of pack hunters. The Etherians formed their own circle, their pale eyes glowing softly as they established mental connections. Sarah found herself with the remaining cadets, the ones who did not fit neatly into their species groups. Ensign Clix, a nervous Skitari whose shell-like exoskeleton clicked when he moved. Cadet Yorna, a Threllan whose multiple arms gave her an advantage in multitasking but made her clumsy in tight spaces. 2 others she barely knew, both from minor species that had recently joined the Galactic Alliance. "The Misfits," Thorax announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Perhaps they will provide an adequate distraction while the real warriors complete the mission." More laughter followed. Sarah noticed that even Commander Vextar seemed amused by the comment, though he quickly returned his expression to professional neutrality. As they entered the simulation pods, Sarah's team members avoided eye contact. They had been grouped together not by choice but by default, and none seemed particularly confident about their chances. The simulation pods hummed to life, and Sarah felt the familiar disorientation as her consciousness was transferred into the virtual environment. Kepler Station materialized around them, Its corridors dark except for emergency lighting that cast eerie shadows on the walls. The air tasted metallic, and distant sounds of screeching echoed through the ventilation systems. Sarah's enhanced vision implants, one of the few pieces of technology that actually worked better for humans than other species, immediately began analyzing their surroundings. Void swarm typically attacks in waves, she whispered to her team. They probe defenses first, then overwhelm weak points. We need to find a defensible position and understand the station's layout before they locate us. Clix's shell clicked nervously. Should we not simply find the nearest exit? The other teams will surely attempt to reach the evacuation pods. That is exactly what they expect, Sarah replied, studying the station schematics on her portable display. The Void Swarm learns from each encounter. They will anticipate conventional tactics. Through her communicator, she could hear the other teams already implementing standard military doctrine. The Xanthari were establishing overlapping fields of fire in the main corridors. The Corvins were setting up in the station's armory, turning it into a fortress. The Etherians were attempting to use their psychic abilities to predict swarm movements. Sarah led her misfit team deeper into the station's maintenance areas, spaces too small for most of the other species to navigate effectively. Her human flexibility allowed her to squeeze through access tunnels that would trap a Corvin, while her team's diverse abilities proved useful in unexpected ways. Yorna's multiple arms could manipulate several systems simultaneously, while Clix's natural shell provided protection in the cramped spaces. The first wave of Void Swarm creatures appeared exactly 47 minutes into the simulation. Sarah watched through security feeds as they overwhelmed the Xanthari position with sheer numbers, their energy-draining attacks neutralizing the crystalline warriors' natural advantages. The Corvins lasted longer but eventually fell when the swarm adapted to their brutal fighting style. As screams echoed through the communication channels, Sarah realized that this simulation would test more than their combat abilities. It would challenge everything they thought they knew about warfare itself. The maintenance tunnels beneath Kepler Station became Sarah's domain, as the Void Swarm tore through the upper levels. Her team huddled in a junction chamber barely large enough for all 5 of them, listening to the horrifying sounds filtering down from above. The other team's communication channels had gone silent one by one, leaving only static and the occasional burst of terrified screaming. Ensign Clix trembled so violently that his exoskeleton created a constant clicking rhythm against the metal walls. "They are all dead," he whispered, his voice barely audible through his breathing apparatus. "The strongest warriors in the academy, and they lasted mere hours." Cadet Yorna's forearms worked frantically over her portable computer, trying to access the station's internal sensors. "The swarm is not following predictable patterns," she reported, her voice tight with concentration. "They are learning from each engagement, adapting their tactics in real time." Sarah studied the data flowing across Yorna's screen. The Void Swarm creatures were unlike anything in standard military databases. They appeared to be insectoid in basic structure, but constantly shifted their form based on the opposition they faced. Against the Xanthari's energy weapons, they had developed reflective carapaces. When confronting Corvin brute force, they had grown additional limbs and hardened their shells. They are not just adapting, Sarah realized, her mind racing through possibilities. They are specifically countering each species' natural advantages. The more predictably we fight, the faster they evolve countermeasures. Through the ventilation system, she could hear the distinct chittering sound that marked a swarm hunting party. The creatures were systematically searching every level, but their focus remained on the main corridors and obvious hiding places. The maintenance areas seemed beneath their notice, possibly because no other team had chosen such an unconventional hiding spot. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed insane to any military instructor. Instead of fortifying their position or seeking escape routes, she began moving her team deeper into the station's infrastructure. They crawled through air ducts, climbed through power conduits, and navigated spaces that the station's original designers had never intended for human occupation. Her human flexibility proved invaluable in these cramped conditions. Whereas Xanthari would have become trapped in a 90-degree turn, Sarah could contort her body to fit through impossible spaces. Her team followed, though with considerably more difficulty. "This is madness," muttered Cadet Drex, a reptilian Varan whose scales scraped against every surface. "We are moving toward the center of the station, not away from it." "Exactly," Sarah replied, consulting her modified scanner. "Every military doctrine teaches us to establish perimeters, and fall back to defensible positions. The swarm expects that behavior because it works against conventional enemies, but we are not facing a conventional enemy. They reached the station's central power core, a massive fusion reactor that provided energy for the entire facility. Sarah had studied Kepler Station's specifications obsessively during her tactical training, memorizing details that most cadets had ignored as irrelevant. Now those boring technical manuals might save their lives. The reactor chamber was a cathedral of technology, with massive conduits running in all directions and control panels that required specialized training to operate. Most importantly, it was a space that the swarm had not yet explored, likely because it seemed tactically insignificant. Sarah immediately began working on the reactor's control systems while her team established watch positions. Her fingers flew over interfaces designed for Xanthari light touch technology, but she had spent months learning to operate alien equipment. Where other humans might have struggled with the unfamiliar controls, Sarah had made adaptability her specialty. "What are you doing?" Yorna asked, her multiple eyes watching Sarah's work with growing alarm. "If you destabilize that reactor, you will kill us all." "Not destabilize," Sarah corrected, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "Modify. The swarm adapts to our weapons and tactics, but they rely on energy absorption to fuel their rapid evolution. What happens if we remove their energy source?" She was implementing a plan that violated every safety protocol in the Galactic Military Handbook. Instead of using the reactor as a weapon, she was turning it into a trap. By carefully adjusting the fusion containment fields, she could create an energy dead zone throughout the station, an environment where the swarm's adaptive abilities would be severely limited. The plan required precise timing and an understanding of both human engineering principles and alien technology that few beings in the galaxy possessed. Sarah had to calculate power distribution patterns, predict containment field fluctuations, and coordinate system shutdowns across 17 different subsystems simultaneously. Her team watched in amazement as she worked. This was not the struggling cadet who could barely lift standard equipment. This was someone operating on a level of tactical thinking that their instructors had not anticipated. Sarah was not trying to fight the swarm with superior strength or natural advantages. She was changing the fundamental nature of the battlefield itself. The first sign that her plan was working came when the chittering sounds from above suddenly stopped. Through security feeds that Yorna had managed to access, they could see swarm creatures stumbling through corridors, their forms flickering and unstable as their adaptive mechanisms failed. "They are becoming confused," Clix observed, his clicking finally subsiding. "Without energy to fuel their changes, they are reverting to basic forms." Sarah smiled grimly as she initiated the final phase of her plan. She had spent 3 years being underestimated, 3 years being told that humans lacked the natural gifts necessary for modern warfare. But those same instructors had failed to understand humanity's greatest strength. Humans were the ultimate adapters, not through rapid physical evolution, but through intelligence, creativity, and the willingness to completely rewrite the rules of engagement. While other species relied on their natural advantages, humans had learned to turn any environment, any technology, any situation to their advantage. The simulation's timer showed 18 hours remaining when Sarah's team emerged from the maintenance tunnels to find Kepler Station transformed into something resembling a ghost ship. Void swarm creatures wandered aimlessly through corridors, their threat neutralized not through superior firepower, but through superior thinking. As they made their way toward the simulation's extraction point, Sarah could not help but wonder how the Academy instructors would react to a human team being the only survivors of a scenario that had been designed to be nearly impossible to survive. The debriefing room fell silent as Commander Vextar reviewed the simulation results for the 3rd time. The holographic display showed impossible statistics that defied every tactical model in the Academy's database. While 4 teams of elite warriors had been eliminated within the first 8 hours, Sarah Chen's Misfit Squad had not only survived the full 48-hour simulation, but had effectively neutralized the entire Void Swarm threat. "This is unprecedented," muttered General Korthak, a massive Corvan whose tusks bore the scars of a dozen real battles against the swarm. He had arrived specifically to observe what the Academy was calling an anomaly in their training data. No team has ever achieved a complete scenario victory in the Kepler Station simulation. Sarah stood at attention alongside her surviving teammates, though she could feel the hostile stares from the cadets whose teams had failed. Thorax, in particular, seemed unable to comprehend how the weakest member of their class had accomplished what seasoned warriors considered impossible. Commander Vextar activated a recording of Sarah's reactor modification, displaying her work in slow motion for the assembled officers and instructors. Cadet Chen, explain your tactical reasoning. Why did you choose to disable the station's power systems rather than establish a defensive position? Sir, the Void Swarm's primary advantage lies in their adaptive capabilities, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the weight of attention focused on her. Every previous encounter followed the same pattern. Our forces would engage using conventional tactics based on their species' natural strengths, and the swarm would evolve countermeasures within hours. She gestured to the holographic display. The simulation data shows that adaptation requires enormous energy expenditure. By creating an energy-depleted environment, I removed the swarm's ability to rapidly evolve, forcing them to rely on their basic biological forms. General Korthak leaned forward, his scarred features expressing skepticism. You gambled the lives of your entire team on an untested theory. What if you had been wrong about their energy requirements? Then we would have died like everyone else, Sarah replied without hesitation. But conventional tactics had already proven inadequate. The definition of insanity is repeating the same actions while expecting different results. A Zenthari instructor named Professor Luxara spoke up, her crystalline form glowing with what Sarah had learned to recognize as intense concentration. Your reactor modifications required simultaneous operation of 17 different subsystems. Most engineers with decades of experience would consider such coordination impossible. Sarah had been waiting for this question. Humans possess what we call neural plasticity, the ability to rapidly form new cognitive pathways. While other species excel in areas where their biology provides natural advantages, humans adapt by learning to think in ways that overcome biological limitations. She looked around the room, noting the mixture of confusion and growing interest on the faces of her instructors. My species survived on a hostile planet not through strength or natural armor, but by learning to use tools, create strategies, and adapt to any environment. What you see as weakness, I see as our greatest strength. Thorax could not contain himself any longer. You speak of adaptation, but you barely passed basic combat training. How can theoretical knowledge compensate for physical inadequacy when facing real enemies? Before Sarah could respond, General Korthak raised a massive hand for silence. An interesting question. Perhaps we should test these theories in a more realistic environment. He turned to Commander Vextar. Are there any active missions where Cadet Chen's unconventional thinking might prove useful? The commander's crystalline features shifted through several color patterns that Sarah recognized as rapid data processing. Actually, yes. The mining colony on Zirion 7 has been sending increasingly desperate reports about Void Swarm activity. 3 military response teams have already been deployed and lost. The situation has been classified as unsalvageable. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. This was not another simulation. Real lives hung in the balance, and the military was apparently desperate, enough to consider sending a cadet who had not even graduated from the academy. The Zirion colony represents exactly the kind of scenario where conventional military thinking has failed, General Korthak continued. The swarm has had weeks to study our response patterns and develop countermeasures. Perhaps it is time to try something completely different. Commander Vextar looked directly at Sarah. Cadet Chen, you would be assigned as tactical advisor to a new response team. Your unconventional methods would be given full support, but you would also bear responsibility for any failures. Are you prepared for that level of pressure? Sarah thought about all the times she had been dismissed, all the laughter when she struggled with standard equipment, all the quiet assumptions that humans did not belong among the galaxy's warriors. This was her chance to prove that humanity brought something unique and valuable to the galactic community. I volunteer for the mission. Sir, she said without hesitation. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Even her own teammates looked shocked that she would accept such a dangerous assignment. But Sarah had made her decision based on more than pride or determination to prove herself. She had studied every available report about Void Swarm encounters, and she had noticed patterns that the military's standard analysis had missed. The swarm was not just adapting to individual species' fighting styles. They were learning about galactic military doctrine itself, developing strategies that countered the collaborative tactics that had made the alliance so successful. What they had not encountered was a human approach to warfare. Because humans were still considered junior partners in galactic civilization, the swarm had no data about how humans fought when they were not trying to imitate other species' natural advantages. As the briefing concluded and assignments were finalized, Sarah realized that she was about to become either a hero or a cautionary tale, but for the first time since arriving at the academy, she felt confident that her human perspective might be exactly what the galaxy needed. The next morning, she would board a transport ship bound for Zerion 7, carrying with her not just the hopes of the mining colony, but the responsibility of proving that humanity deserved its place among the stars. The real test of her theories was about to begin, and failure would mean more than just academic embarrassment. It would mean the death of thousands of innocent colonists who were counting on someone, anyone, to save them from the unstoppable void swarm. The transport ship Stellar Hammer dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Zerion system, and Sarah immediately understood why 3 military response teams had failed. Through the bridge's observation windows, she could see the mining colony's distress signals painting desperate patterns across her tactical display. But something was fundamentally wrong with the data. Captain Draxon, a veteran Corvan officer whose ceremonial scars indicated service in 15 major conflicts, stood beside her reviewing the intelligence reports. "The swarm arrived 6 weeks ago," he explained, his voice carrying the weight of too many failed missions. "Initial estimates suggested a small scouting force, but they have continued to multiply despite our efforts." Sarah studied the tactical readouts with growing concern. These energy signatures do not match standard swarm behavior patterns. The biomass should have consumed the available resources and moved on within days, not established a permanent presence. Major Thys, the Xanthari field commander assigned to lead the ground operations, joined their discussion. Her crystalline form flickered with data streams as she processed real-time intelligence from the colony. "Our previous teams followed standard containment protocols. Establish orbital bombardment zones, deploy heavy weapons platforms, and overwhelm the infestation with superior firepower. And all 3 teams were completely eliminated," Sarah observed, noting details in the combat reports that troubled her. "But look at these casualty patterns. The swarm did not just adapt to our weapons, they learned to anticipate our tactical decisions." She highlighted specific sections of the battle data on her portable display. Team Alpha established overlapping fields of fire exactly as doctrine requires. The swarm flanked them from directions that should have been impossible to access. Team Beta deployed sensor networks in a standard grid pattern. The swarm somehow moved through the gaps without triggering a single alarm. Captain Draxon's tusks clicked together in what Sarah had learned to recognize as deep thought. "You believe they have developed intelligence beyond our current assessments?" "Worse than that," Sarah replied, her human intuition allowing her to see patterns that the military's analytical systems had missed. "I think they have been studying galactic military doctrine for much longer than we realized. Every standard tactic, every conventional strategy, every predictable response has been cataloged and countered." As they approached Zerion 7, the true scope of the disaster became apparent. The mining colony had been transformed into something resembling a massive organism, with swarm structures covering the original buildings like a cancerous growth. But instead of the chaotic infestation patterns that characterized typical swarm behavior, these structures showed clear signs of strategic planning. "They have fortified the colony," Major Thys observed, her voice tight with concern. "This is not random consumption. They are building something." Sarah requested access to the ship's most powerful sensors and began conducting scans that focused on energy patterns rather than visual confirmation. What she discovered sent chills through her human nervous system. The swarm is not just occupying the colony. They are using it as a research facility. The data showed unmistakable signs of experimentation. Captured equipment from the 3 failed military teams had been incorporated into swarm structures, not as food sources, but as study materials. The creatures were systematically analyzing galactic technology, learning not just how to counter it but how to improve upon it. "They are preparing for a larger conflict," Sarah realized, her voice barely above a whisper. "Zerion 7 is not an infestation. It is a training ground." Captain Draxon immediately opened a communication channel to Galactic Command, but Sarah stopped him before he could transmit. "Wait. If I am correct about their intelligence level, they are probably monitoring our communications. Any information we send back will help them prepare for future encounters. The bridge fell silent as the implications sank in. They were not just facing a local crisis that threatened one mining colony. They were confronting an enemy that was actively preparing to challenge galactic civilization itself, using their own tactics and technology against them. Sarah looked around at the assembled officers, noting their expressions of growing despair. These were seasoned warriors who had faced countless battles, but they had never encountered an enemy that learned faster than they could adapt. The standard military response would be to call for massive reinforcements and attempt to overwhelm the threat through superior numbers, but Sarah had studied enough military history to know that such an approach would only provide the swarm with more material to analyze. Every ship they sent, every weapon they deployed, every tactic they attempted would become another lesson in galactic warfare for an enemy that never forgot anything it learned. "We cannot fight them conventionally," she announced, knowing that her words would sound like heresy to trained military officers. "Every standard protocol we follow makes them stronger. Every predictable response teaches them something new about how we think." Major Thiss's crystalline form flickered with what Sarah recognized as extreme agitation. "Are you suggesting we surrender the colony? Allow the swarm to complete whatever they are building?" "No," Sarah replied, her mind already working on plans that would have seemed impossible to implement just days earlier. "I am suggesting we give them something they have never encountered before. Something so completely outside their experience base that their adaptive capabilities become useless." She turned to face the tactical display, where Xerion 7 continued to pulse with alien energy signatures. "Humans have been trying to fit into galactic military doctrine since joining the Alliance. We have been fighting like Xanthari, thinking like Corvins, planning like Etherians, but what if we stop trying to be something we are not?" Captain Draxon leaned forward with interest. "Explain." Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar rush of intellectual excitement that had carried her through 3 years of academic challenges. "What if we fought like humans? Not the humans who try to copy alien advantages, but the humans who survived on a death world using nothing but intelligence, creativity, and absolute stubborn refusal to accept defeat?" The plan that began forming in her mind would require abandoning every principle of military engagement that the other species considered fundamental. It would demand tactics so unconventional that they bordered on insanity. But for the first time since arriving at Xerion 7, Sarah felt confident that they might actually succeed. Sarah's plan horrified every trained military officer aboard the Stellar Hammer. Instead of establishing orbital bombardment positions or deploying ground forces in defensive formations, she proposed something that violated fundamental principles of galactic warfare. She wanted to land a single shuttle directly in the heart of the swarm-controlled colony with minimal equipment and no backup support. "This is suicide," Major Thiss declared, her crystalline form cycling through angry red patterns. "You propose to deliver ourselves directly to the enemy with no means of extraction or reinforcement." Captain Draxon studied the proposal with the careful attention of someone who had survived too many impossible battles to dismiss any strategy outright. "Explain the tactical reasoning, Cadet Chen. How does deliberate vulnerability translate into victory?" Sarah activated a holographic display showing human evolutionary history, images of her species' development from primitive hunters to spacefaring civilization. Every other species in the galaxy evolved as specialists. Xanthari became living weapons with crystalline armor. Corvins developed incredible strength for harsh environments. Etherians gained psychic abilities to survive on hostile worlds. She gestured to images of early humans struggling against predators far stronger and faster than themselves. Humans evolved as persistence hunters. We could not outrun our prey, outfight larger predators, or survive environmental extremes through physical adaptation. Instead, we learned to outlast everything else through sheer stubborn endurance and creative problem-solving. The tactical display shifted to show swarm behavior patterns from previous encounters. The Void Swarm adapts by analyzing threats and developing countermeasures, but their adaptive process requires them to categorize enemies based on observable behavior patterns. What happens when they encounter something that refuses to behave predictably? Lieutenant Korex, a young Xanthari officer, raised an objection. "Even if your theory is correct, how do you propose to survive long enough to implement any strategy?" The swarm will overwhelm a small team within minutes. That is exactly what they expect, Sarah replied, her excitement growing as the pieces of her plan clicked into place. Every military doctrine teaches overwhelming force, defensive positions, and systematic advancement. The swarm has learned to counter all of those approaches. She pulled up schematics of the mining colony, highlighting the underground tunnel networks that connected various facilities. But humans have a different approach to warfare. When faced with superior enemies, we do not try to outfight them. We outlast them. Sarah's plan involved something she called persistence warfare, a concept based on humanity's evolutionary heritage as endurance hunters. Instead of engaging the swarm in direct combat, her team would conduct a campaign of constant, unpredictable harassment that would force the creatures to continuously adapt without ever allowing them to establish stable countermeasures. The key is never giving them time to complete their adaptive cycles, she explained, sketching movement patterns on the tactical display. Humans can function effectively under stress conditions that would exhaust other species. While the swarm expends enormous energy constantly adapting to new threats, we simply keep moving and changing our approach. Captain Draxon's expression suggested he was beginning to understand the audacity of what Sarah proposed. You want to turn the entire colony into a maze where you control the conditions of engagement. Exactly. Underground tunnels, maintenance shafts, ventilation systems, service corridors. Spaces designed for human-sized maintenance workers that larger swarm forms cannot easily navigate. We use the colony's infrastructure as a weapon. Major Thys remained skeptical. Even if you could avoid direct confrontation, how do you propose to actually defeat them? Harassment tactics might buy time, but they cannot eliminate the threat. Sarah's smile carried the confidence of someone who had spent months studying problems that no one else considered worth solving. We do not need to defeat them through destruction. We need to defeat them through exhaustion. The plan she outlined was unlike anything in galactic military history. Her team would establish mobile bases throughout the colony's infrastructure, constantly relocating to avoid detection. They would conduct random attacks designed not to cause maximum damage, but to force maximum adaptation. Every engagement would use different weapons, different tactics, different approaches. The swarm's adaptive capability is their greatest strength, but also their greatest weakness, Sarah explained. Constant adaptation requires enormous energy expenditure. If we can force them to adapt continuously without allowing them to stabilize any countermeasures, we can literally exhaust their ability to evolve. She displayed calculations showing energy requirements for rapid biological modification. Human endurance capabilities far exceed those of most species. We can maintain high activity levels for extended periods while the swarm burns through their energy reserves trying to counter threats that disappear before they can be properly analyzed. The final element of her strategy involved something that made even Captain Draxon look uncomfortable. Sarah proposed deliberately allowing herself to be captured during the later stages of the campaign, but only after the swarm had been sufficiently weakened by the harassment tactics. They will attempt to study me as they have studied captured equipment from previous teams, she explained. But unlike weapons or technology, I can actively resist their analysis while gathering intelligence about their capabilities and weaknesses. Lieutenant Corex looked horrified. You are proposing to sacrifice yourself for tactical intelligence? I am proposing to use humanity's greatest advantage, Sarah corrected. Our ability to endure suffering while continuing to think strategically. No other species in the galaxy shares our capacity for persistence in the face of overwhelming odds. The briefing room fell silent as the assembled officers processed the implications of her proposal. Sarah was not just suggesting unconventional tactics. She was proposing to rewrite the fundamental principles of galactic warfare, based on uniquely human characteristics that other species considered weaknesses. Captain Draxon finally spoke, his scarred features showing a mixture of admiration and concern. Cadet Chen, your plan requires you to survive conditions that would break most trained warriors. Are you certain you understand what you are volunteering for? Sarah looked around the room at beings whose natural advantages made them superior to humans in almost every measurable way. But for the first time since joining the academy, she felt the full confidence of someone who finally understood her own species' unique value. Sir, my entire species survived by refusing to quit when quitting was the logical choice. The swarm has never faced an enemy that gets stronger through suffering rather than weaker. They are about to learn why humans earned their place among the stars. Sarah dropped into the mining colony's ventilation system, just as the first wave of swarm creatures detected her shuttle's landing. Above her, she could hear the chittering sounds of pursuit, but the narrow maintenance shafts were exactly as she had hoped, too confined for the larger swarm forms to navigate effectively. Her equipment consisted of modified gear designed specifically for mobility rather than firepower. Where a standard military loadout would include heavy weapons and protective armor, Sarah carried lightweight tools that could be quickly abandoned and replaced. Every piece of her kit had been selected for its ability to function in spaces where conventional military hardware would be useless. The first 72 hours of her campaign exceeded even her most optimistic projections. Moving through the colony's infrastructure like a ghost, she conducted 17 separate attacks using completely different approaches each time. Improvised explosives in the water recycling system, electromagnetic pulse generators hidden in power distribution nodes, biological agents released through air conditioning networks. Each attack forced the swarm to adapt, developing new sensory capabilities to detect threats, new structural modifications to protect vulnerable systems, new behavioral patterns to counter her tactics. But before they could complete any adaptation cycle, Sarah would disappear into a different part of the colony and emerge with an entirely new form of harassment. Through concealed sensors, she watched the swarm's frustration growing. Creatures that had efficiently analyzed and countered 3 military teams were struggling to categorize an enemy that refused to behave according to any recognizable pattern. Their adaptive mechanisms kept triggering partial responses to threats that vanished before countermeasures could be implemented. By the end of the first week, Sarah could observe measurable changes in swarm behavior. The creatures were becoming increasingly agitated, their movements less coordinated as their collective intelligence struggled to process contradictory data. Energy expenditure for constant adaptation was taking a visible toll on their physical capabilities. She established temporary bases in 17 different locations, never staying in any position for more than a few hours. Food came from emergency rations cached throughout the colony. Sleep occurred in short intervals snatched between movements. Her human endurance training, the same capabilities that had been dismissed as insignificant during academy evaluations, proved essential for maintaining this grueling pace. The breakthrough came during her second week when she realized that the swarm's research facility was not just studying galactic military technology. They were attempting to reverse engineer the fundamental principles of spacefaring civilization itself. Captured computers contained not just tactical data, but economic models, social structures, and technological development patterns. "They are not preparing for a single battle," Sarah whispered into her encrypted communicator during one of her brief check-ins with the Stellar Hammer. "They are planning to replace galactic civilization entirely." The implications were staggering. If the swarm could analyze and replicate the organizational principles that allowed diverse species to cooperate, they could potentially infiltrate and subvert the entire alliance from within. Zerion 7 was not just a training ground for military tactics. It was a laboratory for understanding the social and technological foundations of galactic society. Sarah's harassment campaign took on new urgency as she began targeting the research facilities specifically. But these attacks required her to move deeper into swarm-controlled territory, exposing herself to greater risks with each operation. The creatures were learning to predict some of her movement patterns, forcing her to take increasingly dangerous routes through areas where detection meant certain death. During her third week, exhaustion began taking its toll. The constant stress of evading pursuit, the physical demands of navigating confined spaces, and the mental pressure of continuously developing new tactics were pushing even her enhanced human endurance to its limits. She had lost 15 pounds and had not slept for more than 2 consecutive hours in 10 days. But the swarm was suffering worse. Their constant adaptation efforts had drained energy reserves that should have lasted months. Creatures that had appeared invincible at the beginning of her campaign were now visibly weakened, their forms flickering and unstable as their biological systems struggled to maintain basic functions. The final phase of Sarah's plan required a level of risk that bordered on insanity. She needed to penetrate the central research facility where the swarm's collective intelligence was analyzing captured data. But this facility was heavily defended by creatures that had been specifically modified to counter her infiltration techniques. Sarah spent 3 days observing the facility's defenses, looking for any weakness she could exploit. The swarm had learned from her previous attacks, sealing ventilation shafts, reinforcing structural weak points, and establishing overlapping sensor networks that should have made infiltration impossible. But they had made one critical error in their analysis of human capabilities. Their countermeasures were designed to stop a trained infiltrator using advanced equipment and established techniques. They had not anticipated someone desperate enough to approach the problem from a completely different perspective. Sarah's final infiltration attempt involved something that no military academy would have taught and no sane strategist would have attempted. She entered the facility not through concealed approaches or technical vulnerabilities, but by walking directly through the main entrance during shift change, disguised as one of the captured colonists that the swarm had been studying. The psychological audacity of the approach succeeded precisely because it was so far outside normal tactical thinking. Swarm security had adapted to counter-stealth, technology, and conventional infiltration methods. They had no protocols for handling an enemy who simply pretended to be someone else and relied on confusion rather than concealment. Inside the research facility, Sarah discovered the true scope of the swarm's intelligence. They were not just learning about galactic civilization, they were preparing to become it. Captured personnel had been kept alive not as food sources, but as study subjects for understanding the social and psychological patterns that made interspecies cooperation possible. As she planted her final charges in the facility's core systems, Sarah realized that her success would come at a price that she had not fully anticipated. The explosions would destroy the swarm's research, but they would also trigger security responses that would make her escape virtually impossible. But as she activated the detonation sequence, Sarah felt the same grim satisfaction that had carried her species through countless impossible challenges. She had proved that humanity belonged among the stars, not despite their apparent weaknesses, but because of them. The galaxy's newest warriors had just demonstrated that sometimes the best way to win was simply to refuse to lose. The explosions that destroyed the swarm's research facility sent shockwaves through the entire colony, collapsing tunnels and triggering chain reactions that Sarah had not anticipated. As debris rained down around her, she found herself trapped in a section of the facility that had been sealed off by the blast damage. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on walls that pulsed with dying swarm biotechnology. Sarah's communicator had been damaged in the explosion, leaving her cut off from the stellar hammer and unable to coordinate extraction. Her supplies were nearly exhausted, and the remaining swarm creatures were converging on her location with the desperate fury of a dying hive mind. But instead of panic, she felt a strange sense of calm that she recognized as a uniquely human response to impossible odds. Through cracks in the facility's walls, she could observe the broader effects of her campaign. The swarm's collective intelligence was fragmenting as energy-depleted creatures reverted to basic survival instincts. Without the research data to guide their adaptation, they were becoming increasingly disorganized, attacking each other as often as they searched for her. The captured colonists, freed from swarm control as the creatures lost the energy to maintain mental dominance, were beginning to emerge from hidden shelters throughout the colony. Sarah watched through security feeds as small groups of survivors started working together to establish safe zones and coordinate rescue efforts. But her satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that her mission was not yet complete. The swarm's research had been destroyed, but the creatures themselves remained a threat to the survivors. Her harassment campaign had weakened them significantly, but a final decisive action was needed to ensure they could not recover and rebuild. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed insane to any trained military strategist. Instead of trying to escape or hide until rescue arrived, she began moving deeper into the colony's heart, toward the central hive where the swarm's primary breeding chambers were located. If she could disrupt their reproductive capabilities, she could ensure that this particular infestation would never recover. The journey required her to traverse areas where swarm control was still strong, dodging creatures that had been specifically adapted to hunt her. But 3 weeks of constant evasion had taught her to move through hostile territory with an efficiency that surprised even herself. She had become something that did not exist in galactic military doctrine, a human-shaped weapon of persistent warfare. The central hive was a cathedral of alien biology, With massive chambers devoted to creature production and genetic modification, Sarah realized that she was looking at the source of the swarm's rapid adaptation capabilities. This facility could produce thousands of modified creatures in hours, each one designed to counter specific threats. But the energy demands of her harassment campaign had taken their toll here as well. Production chambers that should have been operating at full capacity were flickering and dim. Genetic modification systems were shutting down as available power was diverted to basic survival functions. Sarah planted her remaining explosives with the methodical precision of someone who had long since moved beyond fear into a state of pure tactical focus. Each charge was positioned to create maximum disruption of the breeding systems, while minimizing damage to the structural supports that kept the tunnels from collapsing completely. As she worked, Sarah became aware that she was not alone in the hive. Something massive was approaching through the deeper tunnels, something that her sensors could not properly classify. When it finally emerged into the central chamber, she understood that she was facing the swarm's central intelligence, the coordinating entity that guided their collective behavior. The creature was unlike anything in the galactic databases, a fusion of biological tissue and captured technology that towered above her like a living monument to alien evolution. It communicated not through sound, but through electromagnetic pulses that she could feel in her bones, expressing concepts too complex for any known language. But Sarah had spent 3 weeks learning to think in ways that confounded swarm analysis. Instead of trying to fight or flee, she simply stood her ground and began speaking, using human language to express ideas that the creature's vast intelligence could not categorize or counter. "You have been trying to understand galactic civilization by analyzing its components," she said, her voice echoing in the vast chamber. "But you miss the most important element. We do not succeed because we are perfect. We succeed because we are willing to fail, learn, and try again." The creature's electromagnetic pulses grew more agitated as it struggled to process her words. Its entire existence was based on adaptation and optimization, concepts that assumed failure was something to be corrected rather than embraced as a learning opportunity. Sarah continued speaking as she activated her final explosive charges, knowing that the detonation would likely kill them both. "You tried to copy our strengths, but strength was never what made us dangerous. What made us dangerous was our refusal to quit when quitting was the rational choice." The explosions began as a deep rumble that built into a crescendo that shook the entire colony. But instead of trying to escape, Sarah simply sat down in the center of the chamber and waited. She had accomplished everything she had set out to do, and more importantly, she had proved that humanity's place in galactic civilization was earned through uniquely human virtues. When the rescue teams from the Stellar Hammer finally found her 3 days later, they discovered Sarah alive in a section of the facility that should have been completely destroyed. The central intelligence was gone, the breeding chambers were ruined, and the remaining swarm creatures had reverted to primitive forms that posed no significant threat. "How did you survive?" Major Thiss asked, her crystalline form flickering with amazement as medical teams checked Sarah for injuries. Sarah smiled weakly, exhaustion finally catching up with her now that the mission was complete. "I did what humans do best. I found a way to turn a hopeless situation into a manageable problem." The rescue of Zerion 7 became a turning point in galactic military doctrine. Sarah's techniques were studied and adapted by military academies across the Alliance, though few species could replicate the specific combination of endurance, creativity, and stubborn persistence that made her approach successful. But more importantly, her victory established humanity's reputation as the species you called when conventional solutions had failed. Other races brought strength, technology, and natural advantages to galactic civilization. Humans brought something far more valuable: the absolute refusal to accept defeat, no matter how impossible the odds. Sarah returned to the academy as a hero, but she never forgot the lesson that her campaign had taught her. Strength was not about being the biggest, fastest, or most naturally gifted. True strength was about finding a way to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless, and discovering victory in places where others saw only failure. The galaxy had laughed at her in training, dismissing humans as the weak link in galactic civilization. But when the real test came, when faced with an enemy that had defeated every conventional approach, it was human persistence that saved the day. The species that had earned their place among the stars by refusing to quit had once again proved that sometimes the best weapon was simply the unwillingness to surrender.